Hello, my name's George Fenton. I'm one of the team working on the ULS project, and I'm pleased today to present a tutorial on the transport chapter of the ULS handbook. Transport is the movement of goods by an appropriate means, for example, by sea or road or air or rail or river. And this ULS chapter focuses mainly on the use of road transport, both local and international or cross-border. And many points discussed are relevant to any means of transport, particularly those to international commercial terms, Incoterms, and customs documentation. The chapter, however, does not cover the issue of transporting staff or people, and that aspect is covered in the fleet management chapter. So the chapter mainly covers 6 areas on, firstly, strategic planning, service procurement, communications and information management, risk management, important documentation, and the impact of transport on people and the environment. First standard on strategic planning is on a transport strategy that is clearly defined to best support relief operations. And the key actions are to firstly assess the infrastructure, access difficulties, or determine what supplies need to be moved and when, considering technical or regulatory and administrative restrictions, as well as those related to road conditions and security. It's important to collaborate with stakeholders to develop a transport plan, ensuring alignment with the overall supply chain strategy. And in terms of stakeholders to engage with, it's entities like various government authorities, private sector, along the route of the transport operation, as well as with the contractor that you may be using. And it's important to coordinate with bodies like the United Nations Logistics Cluster that may have been activated, or any other local coordination mechanism that it would be useful. It's important to plan for each step in the transport journey and match operational and organizational needs, considering the time and costs involved, and to assess what transport services are available and whether other partners might require transport capacity that can be shared. So it's good to make use of the opportunity to pool resources. Indicators to consider are that your plan covers essential needs and is agreed with the stakeholders. It's good to monitor any cost variance from the original transport budget, and good to monitor the percentage of transport movements where times match forecasted expectations, so you know what's working. Other things to consider are that safe transport of humanitarian goods to areas that might have restricted access means that you need to work along a humanitarian corridor. And in such cases, transport may require special consideration for routing, obviously, time of operation, convoy regulations, visibility or permits that may be necessary. With regard to cargo, it's good to label the cargo based on any special restrictions or handling needs. And special cargo can include things like medical supplies, dangerous goods like fuel or chemicals, or equipment that uses lithium batteries. And good to consider customs fees when crossing borders, the need for special insurance policies, technology to track cargo, such as tags or GPS trackers, and also ensure that at a destination there is sufficient capacity to handle the receiving cargo or download data from special tags that might be used in order to produce reports. Standard number 2 is about service procurement, and the standard mentions that goods are delivered at the right time while optimizing costs and the use of resources. And as part of the procuring transport service, it's critical to define roles and responsibilities for every stakeholder, such as a customs broker or freight forwarder or a shipper consignee, that may be involved in, especially in the international aspects of transport. It's good to organize transport according to the availability of different types, as well as the type and the weight of volume of goods, and the time required for delivery, the distances to be traveled, the cost per unit, such as cost per ton or cost per cubic meter, and then as well as identifying risks, which are covered in another standard. When possible, it's good to consolidate cargo to minimize costs and optimize vehicle use. And it's also good to consider, when appropriate, the diversifying transport providers or methods of transport, and in a country, good to vary the routes when possible to mitigate any security risks. Key indicators include things like the percentage of movements arriving on or before a delivery date that was defined, percentage of deviation from an initial quote for transport costs, average loaded volume against total available capacity to make sure that you're optimizing the available capacity that exists, and looking at the proportion of transport that you might own versus transport that you may need to subcontract. Other things to consider are when deciding on what type of transport to use, it's about how urgently it's needed, goods are needed, what types of goods need to be transported, how large or bulky the shipment would be, and the distance traveled. And other things to consider are when developing or managing suitable contracts, particularly for international transport, consider using what are called Incoterms, which are a set of international rules that clarify the main terms of delivery used in contracts. And they define the rights and obligations of the seller and the buyer with respect to things like the party responsible for packaging, insurance, handling, customs clearance, and the point at which any risk passes from the seller to the buyer, or back to the buyer, from the buyer to the seller. And Incoterms in this case have very precise meanings, so it's very important that they are well understood. Above all, ensure that shippers and receivers are aware of the plan and define alternatives if there's any need to make changes. Standard number 3 is about communication and information management. And the standard states that transport is supported by clear communication channels, visibility into cargo movement and handover, and access to relevant information. The key actions are around maintaining a good communication channel with each party involved in the transport process, agreeing what information or reporting is required for each step, using common language or terminology to make communication as easy as possible and as understandable as possible. And you can use templates on documentation to enable information sharing and management as well. To properly manage expectations and to adapt operations accordingly, it's good to establish a monitoring system, both a procedural one as well as a physical monitoring of the transport that's happening, in order to get the feedback about cargo location and condition. Key indicators to use are around communications and the fact that there could be a communications and monitoring system in place, the percentage of the shipment that has timely confirmation according to the nature of the cargo, the percentage of cargo delivered with accurate information on its content, the schedule, the consignee, percentage of shipments with a functioning monitoring mechanism, allowing locating goods whenever needed. That could be used when you're using technology. And the availability of a mechanism to handle complaints that might be raised by key stakeholders, staff, or local communities. Other things to consider are in a communication and monitoring system is that it should allow a good flow of information between stakeholders, such as the cargo owner, the identifying what the cargo is, where it is, what condition it's in, and ensuring that that information is accessible at any given time during the transit of the goods. So monitoring also relies heavily on documentation, which we come to in Standard 5, and that should be adopted to the value of the cargo, not just the monetary value, but also the value for its own purpose. Standard 4 is about risk management and states that transport minimizes financial and material losses and guarantees the preservation of transported goods. Key actions are around risk analysis and considerations for insurance. So conducting a risk analysis related to the shipment means that you need to look at the potential threats and cargo vulnerabilities and implement ways to minimize these risks. Of course, it's really important to have insurance, particularly for international transport movements, and having the right policy in place is really key. So it's good to have a good understanding of what's feasible and ensure that the transport operations and conditions are not harmful for the cargo, won't damage the cargo. And when receiving a consignment, check, of course, the quantity and the quality that you are expecting against documentation and notify the transporter of any problems. Key indicators to use include things like the availability of an updated transport risk analysis, percentage of lost or damaged cargo during transport, percentage of shipments that might be impacted by a problem, or even the percentage of shipments that are impacted by a problem that you did not foresee, so had not been part of the risk analysis. Other things to consider are ensuring that packaging is strong enough for transportation and handling, and that labeling indicates any specific handling needs. It's good to separate cargo by type and compatibility with appropriate regulations. For example, to avoid transporting food with products that have a strong odor like fuel or detergent, and taking basic care to protect the cargo from theft, such as by restricting access to loading or unloading areas, or limiting information about goods being transported. For international transport, as mentioned, insurance is really critical, and of course must also define any realistic maximum liability for the carrier. When receiving a consignment, it's good to use documentation to cross-check quantities of goods delivered. And that could be via a delivery note, an external order, a purchase order, etc. And it's good, of course, to inspect the cargo, looking for damage or leakage or strange smells, and notifying of the transport of any discrepancy. Standard number 5 is about the transportation complies with legal and regulatory requirements. That's really important, particularly for international transport, but also for any other aspects when, say, operating cross-border. And in order to check customs or import restrictions and requirements and understand what those mean, and completing clearance documentation, if possible, in advance of the shipment, ensures that all documents are provided and are accurate is really critical, and ensuring that cargo is packed and loaded properly and secured in compliance with national legislation and regulations. Particularly for road transport, it's really important to verify the identification of the transporter and the registration number of vehicles being operated. Key indicators to consider are around the availability of correct documentation, any percentage deviation from the expected time to clear goods from customs, the amount of money spent on demurrage or retention charges, and any penalties that may need to be paid due to incorrect documentation. Other things to consider are that some commodities may not be permitted or may require special documentation for movement. For example, food or medical items, communications equipment, or dangerous goods like chemicals. So therefore, you may need to provide official classification stating the origin and value, and any lack of any formal classification may delay the importation and create additional cost. Generally, customs clearance can begin once the shipping documents have arrived. However, you can start a pre-clearance process based on these documents, which could save time and reduce costs. So having the right and correct documentation in place before the consignment arrives allows for much quicker clearances and minimizes expenses. The documentation, of course, varies between countries and requirements may change, so you need to stay up to date on the procedures. It's very advisable to contract a clearing or forwarding agent to handle the complexities involved in receiving and clearing international consignments. And in some specific cases, say when a state of emergency has been declared, local authorities may grant free access with simplified customs procedures to import relief items, but just for a limited time. When considering the different types of documents, the common ones are things like delivery note or waybill, freight notice, which can be an email or a fax that informs the consignee of the freight details. Transport letters are things like airway bill, bill of lading, rail consignment note, international consignment note for goods with a legal value. And in these cases, only the consignee mentioned on the bill or an authorized representative can release the goods. An invoice indicates the value of the goods and can be used as the basis for customs declarations and insurance policies. A cargo manifest mentions the type of goods and their origin and destination. Packing list identifies contents of each carton or parcel. A gift certificate is often used when an organization is exempted from import taxes. And a certificate of origin or phytosanitary controls, where some items need additional documents for international transport, can be used. So there are many different types of documents, and there are many technical regulations concerning shipments by air, land, or by sea, and links to further information can be found in the ULS handbook in the transport chapter. Standard 6 is about environmental and safety considerations. And the standard states that transport minimizes harm to people and the environment. So here the key actions are to ensure that risks to the environment, as well as to staff and communities, are included in the risk analysis, as mentioned in Standard 4, and that measures are implemented to minimize these risks. It's important to assess the transport in terms of environmental impact and plan accordingly to minimize any potential negative impact, say due to carbon emissions or waste or hazardous material and noise. It's good to organize briefing sessions with transporters to raise awareness about environmental and protection topics, and to plan for reverse logistics when feasible. So by bringing products back, you contribute to the recycling of goods potentially. Any obsolete goods can be, or equipment can be returned to be reused, or any unused commodities can be returned for future use. Key indicators to consider are the availability of a transport risk analysis, the percentage of recommendations and mitigating measures outlined in the risk analysis that have been addressed, any percentage of carbon reduction due to the best practice of transport operations, percentage of round trips where reverse logistics of commodities was performed, or the percentage of transport service providers who attend a sensitization or training session on environmental protection topics, or the number of events harming people due to the transport operation itself. And in this case, it's good for there to be in place a complaints mechanism to allow local communities that may be impacted to complain. On safety requirements, it's good to respect vehicle capacity, the maximum number of hours that drivers are permitted to drive, the issues around cargo security and handling, any alerts that may be needed about dangerous goods being moved, and the availability of basic safety equipment that might be needed. When planning routes, it's good to consider avoiding spots of high vulnerability, such as schools or heavily populated areas or bad roads. And on the issue of ensuring there's a minimum impact to people, and on the issue of safeguarding, you need to note that there's often an imbalance of power between transporters and the local population and communities where along transport routes served. And especially, but not only, women and girls are impacted, or people who are highly vulnerable to abusive practices such as exploitation and abuse, mean that basic considerations to minimize these practices need to include things like transparency and a clear exchange of information with transport service providers, inclusion of specific terms in a transport contract that are in line with aid sector safeguarding principles, and of course a zero tolerance approach to all forms of exploitation and abuse, and a requirement to have relevant safeguarding policies and practices in place, including requiring transporters to do everything in their power to prevent it from happening, and rigorously addressing and reporting safeguarding concerns as they may arise. So specific safeguarding risks should be considered in the risk assessment and mitigation documents. We hope that this short tutorial has been helpful, and if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to contact the ULS team.